Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Nature Unbound. This is the last part of the last chapter, Diversity and Disturbance in Biological Communities, part number 2. Last week we focused on part number 1, which was that diversity term, or specifically we were talking about biodiversity. Today we're going to be looking at part 2, focusing on the disturbance term. And I have to warn you, this topic is a little disturbing. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so let's start by connecting biodiversity from last week to the new topic this week of disturbance. Suppose you have these two ecosystems. The one on the left is primarily just one species of coneflower. We'll call these coneflowers, although coneflowers look a little different from this. So one species of coneflower on the left. On the right, we have a community which is composed of 3 different species of coneflowers, indicated by the different colors and the different heights. So which of these two communities has a higher biodiversity? Obviously the one on the right. How does this connect to our topic for today, disturbance? Well, let's suppose one season the sun is exceptionally hot. There's exceptionally little rainfall, and we have a serious drought. And it turns out that the yellow coneflowers are particularly susceptible to drought. What would the result be? The community on the left, which consists of just one species, is going to really be hurt by this particular drought. Whereas the community on the right, yeah, they're going to lose the yellow coneflowers, but the rest are going to do all right. And this community is going to be more stable and more resistant to this drought. This drought is an example of a disturbance. So a disturbance is some sort of ecological change that disrupts an ecosystem. Besides drought, there are a lot of other disturbances that can happen to an ecosystem. These can be either natural or man-made disturbances. For instance, we've got volcanoes. These can cause lots of destruction, wipe out entire ecosystems. Floods, which we experience a lot around here along the Mississippi River. Fire, tornadoes, any natural disaster like that can damage or disrupt an ecosystem. But then there are man-made disturbances. For instance, you think of an oil spill, or a real common one is deforestation. So logging operations will come through and they can remove a whole forest and turn that into lumber. This is needed. I mean, we do need lumber for things. There's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. So what do you think? Is disturbance a bad thing? At face value, it does look sort of like a bad thing. And certainly, too much disturbance is a bad thing for an ecosystem. But it turns out that some level of disturbance is actually very beneficial for an ecosystem. Think of it like an eraser. Is an eraser a bad thing? It depends. Suppose you're a teacher and you have just filled your entire whiteboard with critical information for your students, but they need more information. So you're going to take your eraser. The eraser here is our disturbance. And with that eraser, you're going to erase some of that information on the whiteboard, which represents our ecosystem. You're disturbing it. You're removing it. But what's the point of that? Now there is more room. So you can see how disturbances can actually create space for new things to grow. And it's really interesting to study how nature fills in a gap that's created by a disturbance. In fact, we have a special term to describe this process, and it is called succession. Succession, simply put, is a sequence of changes. Did you know that right now you are undergoing a succession? You're undergoing a sequence of changes. You started out as a little baby, and then you became a kid. Now you're a teen. Pretty soon you're going to be off into the workforce. Then maybe someday you'll have kids of your own, and eventually you will, well, if you make it that far, you'll be an elderly person, and we'll stop it right there. But this is a sequence of changes that you're going through right now. So ecosystems go through a sequence of changes just like this when there is a gap to be filled that was created by a disturbance. In the case of an ecosystem, it's going from nothing or having no species there, and I'll talk about what that means, to something like this, having a complete ecosystem with a lot of diversity in it. And again, this whole process is called succession. So in ecology, there are two types of succession, depending on how severe the disturbance is and what starting material you have to work with. These are called primary and secondary succession. In primary succession, which we won't spend much time talking about, when we say you start with nothing, you really start with nothing. So this is after a really severe disturbance, like a volcano, and it completely destroys all the life around that volcano, and it leaves you with bare rock. That is your starting material. This is really tough to get a new ecosystem started because you have to get some soil made, and it takes a long time for that rock to get broken down into soil. It's not something we really see going on much around here, except one close to home example that I think is kind of like this is if you imagine a development where they've put in a big shopping center. So they have a big store with a giant asphalt parking lot, and then that gets abandoned. Think about that old Venture Kmart Plaza on Dunn Road and West Florissant Road. You know what I'm talking about? So that's abandoned. So it's basically like a giant slab of rock. Now, given enough time, that rock would be converted into soil and a whole new ecosystem would grow there. That's an example of primary succession. Secondary succession is a little easier. It takes a little bit less time because this is when a disturbance that's not so severe goes through and it wipes out an ecosystem, but it leaves the soil there. So it could be like a fire, it could be like a flood. So there's still soil to start with. So let's look at the sequence of changes that occur during secondary succession. I want you to imagine you go on a trip out into the country, and there was this forest there at one point, and it was removed to make room for an agricultural field, a cornfield, let's say. And the farmer uses that cornfield for a while. And one year he plows over that cornfield, but then he stops farming it and he leaves it to nature. So this is an example of secondary succession. Imagine you're standing on the edge of that bare ground. What is the sequence of changes that it's going to go through to develop into a full-blown ecosystem? Fast forward in time, come back a year later, what would you expect to see covering that bare ground? Things like grasses and weeds. These are things that grow quickly, and they're going to easily fill in that empty space. But it doesn't end there. Come back the next year, and what are you going to find? You're going to find a lot of the same weeds and grasses and wildflowers that you saw before, but there's going to be some bigger plants that start to creep up. Now there's a little more time has passed, and we're going to start to see some shrubs, and perhaps some young trees have found their way into this field. Now they're still very small, but you're going to notice the color brown start to show up amongst these branches. These are woody plants now that have moved into this field. They take a little longer to get established, but once they're established, they can start growing larger and larger. Let's come back 5 years later. You're going to see those trees are now even larger, and they're starting to look like trees. They're starting to cast some shade down on the ground. That means there's not as much light at the ground for all the grasses and the wildflowers, so you won't have as much of that. You're still going to have some, though, and you'll still have some shrubs. Now, I want you to bring your grandkids back to this same field 50 years later, and what's it going to look like? Now it will have developed into a mature forest. So it's going to be thick with trees, with a dense canopy of leaves blocking almost all the sunlight, so there won't be a lot of stuff growing at ground level. There will be some. This is a mature forest, so we started with bare ground, and in our area, given enough time, that would develop into a mature forest. We call that mature forest a climax community. This is the end of the line. There's nowhere else to go from here, and it will remain a mature forest until the next disturbance. Secondary succession like this has played out over and over again all over the world. And it's really interesting when you look at the plants that first arrive and compare those to the plants that are in the climax community. You're going to find some very different adaptations. So let's compare the ragweed at the beginning to the oak at the end. The ragweed is an herbaceous plant. It doesn't have a woody stem. It's got these pointed, ragged looking leaves, and it's very noticeable for its stalks at the top that have all of its flowers and the seeds. The oak, on the other hand, is a very big plant, lives for a long time, has these huge wooden trunks. Of course, it also produces seeds in the form of acorns. So they're both flowering plants that produce seeds, but that's about where the similarity ends. The ragweed is early successional, so it's going to show up early during this secondary succession cycle. The oak tree is late successional. It shows up towards the end. And when you compare the characteristics between these two plant types, early versus late successional, there are a lot of interesting features. Consider the number of seeds. So ragweed, they have tons and tons of seeds, whereas later on, there's not much space left. And so the oak trees, they don't produce a lot of seeds. They're relatively few. One oak tree, even though it's huge, it probably produces the same amount of seeds, acorns, as just a couple of ragweed plants. The seed size is also interesting. So they're very small in these early successional. That way they're very easily spread out and carried by birds and the wind to scatter them around the open field. Late successional species, like the oak tree, have large seeds. These large seeds are attractive to animals, and those animals can take them and go plant that seed far away from the original oak because there's no more room there at the oak. The growth rate for early successional plants is rapid. They grow fast, they produce their seeds fast, and then they die and come back again the next year. The oak is extremely slow. They are very long-lived. They will outlive us in many cases. We've got fresh oak trees that have been planted. You'll have to bring your grandkids back to see them full grown. Early successional plants are also very small. They don't have a lot of time to get big. Their goal is to just fill up that space. The oak tree, on the other hand, because of its slow growth rate, it produces a very strong woody material that enables it to grow huge. This is going to be an advantage at those latter time points because it's able to put its leaves high above the ground where there's plenty of sunshine. And that brings us to this last one, the shade tolerance. Early on during succession, there are no big plants around. Everything is small. So early successional plants love the sunshine, and they need the sunshine to grow. But then later on during succession, as larger plants start to arrive and start to grow, they start to cast shade upon the plants that are beneath them. So late successional species, they either have to be very shade tolerant to be able to survive underneath the trees, or they have to be big enough to be on top. So in this chapter, you've seen how disturbances create space in an environment, which then get filled in by new species in these different stages of succession, eventually resulting in that climax community which hangs around until the next disturbance. And ladies and gentlemen, this officially wraps up the last chapter of our Nature Unbound